Hi everybody, welcome back. My name is Emmanuel, and before we start I just want to thank my friend Jonathan for borrowing me his microphone so I can actually have some really good audio quality while I do these recordings. So thank you, Jonathan. And now back to our CSS stuff. In this lesson we'll be focusing on basic CSS selectors. Just before we start, I want to say that this lesson will be split into 2 or 3 lessons because selectors are so varied and there's so many of them that I just had to split them in more than one lesson. And in this first lesson, we're going to focus on somewhere between 9 and 10 types of selectors. Some of them you've already seen and you're familiar with them. So let's just jump right into it and let's see what each of them do. The first one, which we've already been used to. Oh, I have a style tag which is open here. The one that we've been used to is the tag selector. I like to call it the element selector because you're selecting an element, but it's also an HTML tag you're selecting. And by that I mean you can write P, curly brackets, and then give it a color of light gray. Let's just say, which is not the best color. And when you write it like this, you're using the tag selector because you're just saying this specific tag should have this specific styling in the whole page. And we've been using that up until now, and it's nothing new. But that's how it's called, tag selector or element selector, or however you want to call it. It's still fine because mostly everybody knows what you mean. Next up, we have the ID selector, which I think we've seen it already. Very small. I've just added an ID to the paragraph, and let's delete this. And the way you reference the ID in CSS is a hashtag, pound symbol, or a hash symbol, and then you just write the name of the ID. In this case, it's very small, curly brackets, and then we can give it a background of maroon. I've got a few colors, which I'm always doing in my basic tutorials. And that's the way you specify an ID selector. Word of warning though, it's not the best thing to use an ID. The reasoning for that is, first of all, it's not modular, it's not flexible. Since an ID is something unique to a page, you can apply only one ID to one element at one time in one page. So that doesn't give us really any kind of place to work with in CSS. So at all times you should use the next selector, which is the class selector. Let's just remove this ID here, and let's say class is going to be red. And the way you reference the class in CSS is use a dot or stop sign, however you want to call it. Red, curly brackets, then color is going to be red. And that's how you reference a class in CSS. Now the advantage of classes is that you can have multiple classes on multiple elements at once. So let's add the class large here, and then let's add the class large to the span over here. And then in the CSS, we're going to say the class large will have a property of font size to be 32 pixels. And just like that, we made these 2 elements which have this exact class font size of 32 pixels. And as you can see, the advantage of classes is that you can add multiple classes to an element again. And of course, when you add the class large, it's not going to take the class red from the other element that you linked. So because they have this class in common, that does not mean that they mutually share the classes, unless you do some really freaky stuff in the CSS. So now that we got the class element out of the way and we know that the class is the way to go, let's see another really interesting one. And for this one, I'm actually going to leave the red class right there. Now, some of you who might be familiar with SQL, and I think it might be used in some other programming languages. The asterisk sign, or if you want to call it the star, that means all. So basically select all. That's what it does in SQL. That's kind of what it does in CSS as well. If we say color, let's say blue, then all of our elements are going to have the color blue, except of course the ones that we specifically define later on to not have that color or have a different color. And this is really useful, especially in later lessons where we're going to see stuff like box sizing, which we'll not be going into now. So this is really good when you want to apply some specific styling for all of your elements. But word of warning, the select all or the asterisk is, as we saw, extremely powerful, but it can be dangerous. So don't apply random styling with this element, except if you really want your page to look pretty weird. But we're going to see later on in the course where we can actually use it and when it's good. The next one is the descendant selector. This is something that we might have seen in the first lesson. I'm not exactly sure, but let's see how it is. We've already seen the tag or element selector, and when we say descendant selector, it means that we're saying we want to target the paragraph in the div, and in this case we want it to be a font size of 2 pixels. Okay, maybe 10 pixels, so we can actually see what's happening. So this, as simple as that, this is the descendant selector. It's going to search in your DOM for the div that has paragraphs in it, and it's going to apply that style right there. Next up, since we're on this chapter, we have the adjacent selector, and the adjacent selector is defined as this, the plus symbol. For some reason, addition means adjacency in CSS. And what does this do? Let's see what happens if we decide to add another div here, and we add another paragraph in here with some text. Okay, nothing happened, right? Because we can see that it's another font size. But what happens if we put a paragraph right outside of a div and we put some small text here? It selected the adjacent element to the initial element. So we said find a div and the next paragraph that's going to be adjacent to it, so meaning the next one after, apply this styling. If we add another one, some other text here, this will not be affected, as you can see on the right side. So it's only going to be the next sibling after it. Pretty simple, right? Plus sign means the next thing. Now, the next one is the direct children selector. This is when stuff gets interesting. We're going to use the greater than sign, and we can see that it already applied this styling to some of the elements. And as you can see, it's applying them correctly because we have a div and inside we have some paragraphs. But what happens if in this div we have something else, which is not a div? Let's say we have a header for some reason, and in here we have a paragraph with text. Since this means direct children selector, you know, this P is still a child of the div, but it's not a direct child of this div. It's a direct child of the header. So with the direct children selector, you select only the direct elements of the parent. In this case is the div with its paragraphs. So it's not going to affect something else, except if instead of header you would have another div, and it would apply a new rule in this scope or this context, not in this one. I just made it sound maybe a little bit more complicated than it is, but we're doing really good until now, right? It's pretty easy. Some pluses, some greater than signs, some asterisks. It kind of makes sense. And now to learn a new word in the English language, because I'm pretty sure not all of you might have known the name of this symbol, And for those of you who've been gaming, you're gonna know it as the console button. But you have to press Shift and the button right next, it's usually next to your 1 on your keyboard. Oh, and I already popped up. Just don't keep it pressed because you're gonna pop up your filter keys thing on Windows. So the button right next to your 1, if you press Shift and press on that one, you're going to get the tilde symbol. And the tilde symbol in the CSS is the selector for the sibling combinator. Sounds really complicated, but if we take a step back and if we remember the plus and what did the plus do, this is more or less the same, but it's not as strict. So when we put the tilde sign, we're saying, you know, the next children, or the next, I'm sorry, not the next children, but the next siblings, because these are brothers, right? In DOM structure, these paragraphs are brothers with the div. Although they're different elements, they are siblings. And so after the divs, add the font size of 10 to all the paragraphs after it. And we can see it right here with this lorem ipsum, which is right around here. Yes, because we have a div here, and then the next paragraph after it is this one, and then we have nothing else. We only have spans, and in this case it's going to style these 2 paragraphs. So funny name, let me just write it here. It's called the sibling combinator. So sibling combinator, it has the tilde sign, close resemblance, I'm sorry, to the adjacent selector, which is a plus, but only more forgiving, more light. And now let's get to the fun stuff. Before we get to the fun stuff, let's delete some of this lot of text that we have in here. Okay, now we're going to get to some really interesting, neat stuff, and I'm going to uncomment this anchor tag. Okay, now let's get to pseudo selectors, or rather say pseudo classes. So pseudo classes, really freaky name for something extremely simple. You know, every time you go on a link, you see the ugly underline by default, and then you go with the mouse, you have the hand, and then when you click, it kind of changes the color, and this one is a darker purple, which means we've clicked on it at a point. So that's basically what this does. It allows you to customize those states. Let's see that in action. If we say anchor tag, comma, hover, and then we say we want it to have a, let's say, a font size of 20 pixels. Then on the hover, this pseudo class, or this anchor tag, will have on the hover state a font size of 20 pixels. Then we also have the active state, which is the state when you actually hold the mouse button on it. So it's not the hover, but it's the click event. And then we also have other pseudo classes, like we can use for an input the state that it's in when you're with the mouse in the input element and you can type stuff. That's called a focus. So we can say input, comma, focus is going to have, I don't know, padding. I'm just coming up with this stuff on the fly. So now when we go inside, we can see that when we have the class of focus, when we enter the focus state, then we apply the specific styling to it. And if you're thinking, okay, but how many of these kind of pseudo classes exist? Well, there are a few of them, that is true, but most of them are not that that difficult to learn because they're some really simple states. You can have, of course, the hover state, as we saw, and that's not that is not a state that is limited to a link or an anchor tag. I just showed it in this scenario because we're all more used to it. But we have basically the hover, then we have the active, as we just showed a few lines earlier. I'm sorry. We also have the visited, so what's going to happen with that element if you have clicked on it and you're coming back. Then we also have the focus state that I just realized that I wrote down here, and these are the most common ones they're going to use. There's also stuff like first child, nth child, and first letter, some other stuff that we're going to focus on in the later lesson. But just know that, the most common ones are hover, focus, and active. The ones that you should know at least for now. So let's make a quick recap of all my continuous talking for 15 minutes now. We've learned about selectors. We've learned what a tag selector is. So a tag selector is something that is going to select a specific tag, something like an anchor tag. Then we've learned about the ID selector, which selects an ID, and the way you write it is hashtag something. We've learned about class selector, which you define as being a stop and then the name of the class. And then we've learned about the all selector, which is defined as being the asterisk. Then the descendant selector, which descendant selector, which it looks something like this. Let's say the anchor tag in a list element. We've seen the adjacent selector, which is the plus sign. It's the one that selects the element right next to the one that we defined. We also viewed the direct children, if I could write it correctly, children selector, which looks something like the greater than sign. Then the sibling selector, which is the one with the tilde sign, and also pseudo classes, which is that thing with the comma and the hover state. So these are the things that we learned right now. There are a lot more advanced selectors that exist currently, and we're gonna have even more advanced ones in the future, but don't worry, we're gonna see them in action soon enough. And yes, that was about it. Thank you for your time, and I will see you in the next lesson, where we'll be covering some of the visual elements in CSS, because we have just finished with the key concepts. So thank you a lot for getting this far. Please leave me a comment if you think something is missing, I should add something else. If you like it, if you don't like it, subscribe, and I will see you in the next lesson, where stuff is going to get a lot more visual and a lot more fun. Have a great day.